Hey, Christopher here. Buckle up, because we're about to slither real-life nightmares where the only warning was a split second of fang, coil, or venom. From a young reptile handler who chose to hide a snakebite rather than admit a mistake, to a grandmother who reached into a dark cupboard before sunrise and never spoke another word. But first, let's go to Indonesia, where a woman just needed headache medicine, but led herself into a python's belly instead. It was June 11th, 2017, on Muna Island in southeast Sulawesi, Indonesia, and the kind of humid afternoon that makes the air feel like a wet cloth pressed against the skin. The sort of day where a woman walks a familiar path without thinking twice and does not come home. Now, you need to understand the setting first to make this story make sense. The rubber plantations of southeast Sulawesi are not wilderness in the dramatic sense. They are working land. Rows of tapped trees bleeding latex into small cups. The ground perpetually damp, layered with years of fallen fronds and rotting organic debris. Children are told not to cut through certain sections alone. Adults talk about the ground itself more than anything in it, how it shifts, how it hides things, how sound gets swallowed by it. The woman who would be found in that field 3 days after turning 43 was named Laira Patu. Laira had 3 children, the youngest still in primary school. She was a rubber tapper who had worked the same plantation routes outside her village for years. Her husband worked irregular hours doing construction when it was available. There was a goal she had talked about with her husband quietly, saving enough to repair the roof before the next rainy season. Small, practical, achievable. The kind of goal that assumes tomorrow. On June 11th, 2017, Laira left her home in the early afternoon to walk to a roadside kiosk roughly almost a mile away to buy headache medicine. She took the plantation shortcut. A neighbor later mentioned that he had noticed a section of flattened grass and disturbed debris that morning along that same path and had not thought much of it. The afternoon was ordinary. Nobody heard anything significant until a brief shout, a single sound that a villager nearby would later describe as short and cut off. Not a scream, just a sound that stopped. Now, in a place like that, it could have been any animal. Unfortunately, that day, the man who heard it actually assumed it was. When Laira had not returned by dusk, her husband began asking around. A group of neighbors took flashlights into the plantation. Moments later, what they found first were drag marks in the soft earth, a rough furrow stretching approximately 15 feet through the debris, ending where the ground cover thickened. Nearby, a python lay visibly distended, largely motionless. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes on Earth. Adults in the range found across Sulawesi and the surrounding islands regularly reach 16 to 20 feet, with confirmed specimens exceeding 23 feet and weighing over 165 pounds. They are ambush predators, not pursuit hunters. They wait. You may already know that their strike is not about venom. It is about grip. Now, based on what I've read, they are not rare on Muna Island. They are simply rarely seen. The python they found was estimated between 20 and 23 feet. Likely thinking of the worst, they cut it open. And to everyone's horror, their fear was confirmed. Laira's body was inside, almost intact. Her arms were at her sides, with noticeable compression, bruising along the torso, and limbs consistent with constriction, with minimal visible digestion. She had been swallowed, head first. Her husband was the one who had to be pulled back first. He had been among those who followed the drag marks into the plantation and was still holding a flashlight when they cut the python open. When it became clear what they were looking at, he reportedly stepped away without speaking and sat down in the wet leaf litter just off the path, refusing to look again as others took over. Local authorities were informed afterward, though no emergency response was required or available at the scene. She died in that field, within a short distance of a path she had walked hundreds of times. Her children were still at home with a neighbor when word spread back to the village. By the time the body was brought out of the field, none of them were at the plantation anymore, and they were kept indoors through the night, while relatives handled the arrangements. She was buried the following morning. It's harrowing to think that she was simply on a path she trusted, doing something ordinary, and that is precisely why it happened. But unlike Laira, the guy knew exactly the danger he was in. But what gets me isn't the attack. It's what he did after. It was September 3rd, 2015, at the Limbe Wildlife Center on the southwestern coast of Cameroon, where the air smelled of damp soil and raw meat. and where a 26-year-old man spent his last coherent hours alone in a storage corridor, methodically tightening a cloth around his forearm, as if willpower alone could hold back what was already spreading through him. His name was Etienne Kova, and the Wildlife Center was still new territory for him, not geographically, but professionally. Etienne had worked at the center before, but in maintenance, fixing things, moving things, staying outside the enclosures. The reptile handler role was a step up with better pay, and just like 99% of us on our first new career break, he knew people were watching to see if he could handle it. He was the new guy in a room full of people who weren't. That morning, September 3rd, 2015, he was assigned to clean the terrarium housing one of the facility's gaboon vipers. He had completed a feeding earlier in the shift. However, here's where the first domino falls. At some point between the feeding and the cleaning, the secondary lock on the enclosure was not fully latched. It wasn't broken nor missing, just not pressed far enough to catch. Due to what I'm assuming was a newbie mistake rather than incompetence, he likely didn't notice it, and he began the cleaning anyway. The gaboon viper is the largest viper on the African continent. Adults routinely reach 5 feet in length and can weigh over 20 pounds. What makes them particularly dangerous isn't aggression, they are actually slow to provoke. What makes them dangerous is their fang length, which can reach 2 inches, and their venom yield, among the highest of any snake in the world per strike. A single bite can deliver enough hemotoxic venom to destroy tissue, collapse blood vessels, and trigger system-wide hemorrhaging. They don't need a second shot. Now the second domino. While wiping down the back panel of the terrarium, Etienne's forearm moved within range. The viper struck once, 2 deep punctures, straight into the forearm, from fangs long enough to reach past the muscle surface. He made 2 mistakes, and that was all that was needed. The bleeding started immediately. The swelling followed within minutes. Not gradual, but visible, spreading up from the wrist toward the elbow, like something inflating under the skin. A quick Google search describes the pain from a gaboon bite, according to survivors, as immediate and severe, a deep burning pressure that doesn't plateau. Now here's where it gets frustrating for me when I read this case. He did not tell anyone. CCTV footage reviewed afterward showed him walking to a utility sink, running water over the arm, then wrapping it with a cloth. He returned to the storage areas of the facility. He did not go to the on-site medical station. He did not flag down a colleague. He sat alone and, over the following hours, repeatedly tightened the cloth around his forearm as the swelling continued to rise. Hemotoxic venom from a gaboon viper doesn't just damage the bite site. It disrupts the blood's ability to clot, breaks down tissue from the inside, and causes internal bleeding throughout the body. Within a couple of hours, his skin around the bite would have begun blistering. His blood pressure was likely dropping. CCTV captured him visibly pale, moving slowly, at one point bracing against a wall. He was confused. His body was telling him everything he needed to know, and he still didn't call for help. Roughly 5 hours after the bite, Etienne collapsed in a storage corridor. Want to know the craziest part? Anti-venom was actually available on site. The center kept it precisely for situations like this. A colleague found him approximately 20 minutes later, but at this point, the delay had cost him too much. The venom load from a full gaboon strike, combined with 5 hours of no treatment, had already done irreversible damage. Etienne Kova died before he could be stabilized. He never made it outside that facility. Imagine that. Dying because asking for help felt worse than handling it alone. That kind of pride, the kind that makes a new employee hide a deadly mistake, is genuinely more dangerous than the snake. The center quietly retrained staff afterward. New protocols, tighter checks, the usual institutional response. Now, if the anti-venom was easily within reach for Etienne, this next guy was 40 miles offshore. It was April 22nd, 2016, 40 miles off the coast of Palawan, Philippines, where the South China Sea opens into deep water, and the nearest hospital is a radio call, and several hours of engine noise away. Ramil Dachera was 38 and had worked commercial fishing boats since he was 19. He operated out of a small cooperative based in Puerto Princesa. His reputation was for urgency. People said that he cleared nets faster than anyone, sorted catch while others were still pulling lines, and pushed departure times to squeeze every productive hour from a trip. He had a wife, 3 children, and a 4th on the way. The mortgage on his family's house in Barangay Santa Lourdes was 14 months from paid off. He's a hard worker, and I think whatever he had to do that day was justified as a father. But the question is, does nature care? That morning, the net came up dense and tangled. Mixed into the fish and debris was something slender and banded, coiling loosely near the lower mesh. One of the crew, a younger man named E-Boy, paused and pointed at it. It moved wrong for an eel. Too controlled, too deliberate. Ramil glanced and kept pulling, Little did they know, these are beaked sea snakes. They are among the most venomous marine reptiles alive, reaching roughly 3 to 4 feet in length and carrying a venom that is both neurotoxic and myotoxic. Now what this means is that it attacks nerve signaling while simultaneously destroying skeletal muscle on a systemic level. Their small fixed fangs make bites easy to dismiss. There is often almost no immediate pain, and the entry marks are minor enough to ignore, which is precisely what makes them fatal at sea. Rammel's left hand closed around the net several inches from the snake's tail. The animal twisted fast and bit through the thin fabric of his shorts, just above the upper thigh. He likely felt it as others saw him pull back and looked at the mark. 2 small punctures, barely bleeding. He pressed a thumb against the spot for a moment, then went back to the net. Probably didn't think much of it. However, within the first hour, he sat down on a storage crate. He told E-Boy his legs felt heavy. He rubbed his thighs with both hands. He did not stop the work, but he stopped participating in it, watching the remaining crew finish the net. His speech became quieter. Around 90 minutes in, he lay down on the deck without being asked to. His arms, when E-Boy tried to help him sit, had almost no resistance. The crew suddenly realized that this was an emergency. The boat turned for shore. They were roughly 40 miles out, close to 4 hours at cruising speed. By the 3rd hour, Ramil could not lift either arm off the deck. His breathing had become audible, each inhale visibly incomplete. His skin had taken on a grayish cast. E-Boy made a radio call to the Coast Guard. The response confirmed what the crew already understood. No rescue vessel could reach them in time. They were told to keep him calm and keep moving toward shore. By the 5th hour, his breathing had become shallow and sporadic. The crew attempted to keep his airway open and stimulate his breathing, but none of them had oxygen equipment or advanced medical training. He died on the deck before the boat reached the pier. Coroner summary: death attributed to respiratory failure, secondary to systemic envenomation, consistent with sea snake bite. Laboratory findings indicated significant myoglobinuria and critically elevated serum potassium, consistent with widespread rhabdomyolysis. No medical intervention was available at the time of respiratory arrest. Death was ruled accidental. His body arrived at port that evening. His wife was at the pier, belly swollen, their kids behind her. The boat went back out 3 days later, because it had to, because the mortgage did not pause for grief, and because that is simply what working those waters demands. There is something genuinely bleak about a man spending his last hours on a deck he had stood on 1,000 times. The next story happened in the same country, but the victim isn't a grown man taking on the risk to provide. It's a 14-year-old kid just trying to get somewhere. It was November 2nd, 2014, and the barangay roads outside Sorsogon City had gone quiet in the way they only do when the living are occupied with the dead. All Saints' Day had passed, but the wakes in the surrounding towns were still burning candles, still drawing people through the dark. Jorel James Maddock was 14 years old, a second-year student at a public high school in the municipality, known among his classmates for 2 things. He was rarely late, and he almost always took the short way. Reports say that he had been asked by his mother to attend the wake of a neighbor's elderly uncle in the next barangay, a 20-minute walk by road, or roughly 8 minutes through the coconut grove that cut diagonally between 2 properties. He had likely taken that grove route dozens of times. He left the house just after 6 p.m. The coconut grove sat between an unused agricultural lot and a drainage channel, its floor choked with fallen fronds, low ferns, and years of accumulated organic debris that retained moisture long after rain. Sounds familiar? Just like in the first story, it was exactly the kind of habitat that reticulated pythons exploit. It's crazy to know the fact that even just a 12-foot reticulated python can overpower a teenager if it secures a wrap high on the chest or neck early in the struggle. The grove had other snakes, everyone knew that. Small ones, the kind that moved away when you kicked through the brush. Joran's sandals were rubber-soled, and he walked fast. To be fair, there was no reason, in his experience, to treat the path differently than he always had. According to authorities, he was likely 40 yards into the grove when the strike occurred. A reticulated python must have positioned in the ground cover alongside the trail, lunged laterally, latched onto the left side of his torso with its teeth, and initiated a rapid coil response around his upper body. The initial impact evidently knocked him sideways. The snake's coils reached his chest within seconds, and as Jorel struggled and twisted, the upper coil migrated toward his neck and lower jaw. The movement was probably not cinematic. It was mechanical, grinding, and incrementally tighter with each second. Two men from a nearby house heard a short, strangled sound, followed by rustling and crashing through the undergrowth. They entered the grove with machetes already in hand, guided by the sound. What they found was the snake fully engaged, its body wrapped in two overlapping loops from Joral's chest to his neck, its tail anchored against a root cluster. The boy was face down, making weak, irregular movements with his legs, but unable to free his arms. The men struck the snake's mid-body repeatedly. After several blows, the coils slackened enough to be unwound. However, Jarrell was not breathing. His lips and fingernails were already blue. His neck showed deep circumferential indentations, the tissue beneath the skin discolored and swollen. One of the men began chest compressions, while the other ran to the road. There was no ambulance available. They carried Jarrell on a wooden board to a motorcycle, then to the nearest rural health clinic. He arrived approximately 25 minutes after the attack and was declared dead on arrival. The attending physician noted cervical compression, consistent with constriction, cyanosis, and evidence of asphyxiation. Several curved puncture wounds and superficial tearing were documented along the left side of the torso, where the snake had maintained its bite hold during constriction. Cause of death: mechanical asphyxiation, secondary to python constriction. It's baffling to think that his mother had asked him to go to a wake, and 3 days later, the barangay held one for him instead. Since the funeral service was handled by the same parlor, the candles were the same, the plastic chairs were the same. The difference was the photograph propped beside the coffin. Alright, this next one drove me crazy when I was researching it, because the snake wasn't even the worst part. It was the days that came after. It was August 19th, 2018, on the outskirts of Chennai, India. And by the time Naveen Suri lay down on his floor mat, he had less than 3 days left to live. Naveen was 29, a delivery driver for a small logistics company operating out of Ambattur. He ran routes 6 days a week, mostly auto parts and packaged goods, and was known among co-workers as dependable in the mornings and unreliable by midnight. He lived alone in a single-room rental attached to his uncle's property, a concrete structure with a corrugated roof, exposed drainage, and a storage corner stacked with feed sacks, broken crates, and accumulated debris. The floor mat beside that corner was where he slept on nights he came home too late or too drunk to bother with his cot inside. It was a habit his family had noted and dismissed. The storage corner backed against a low wall where rodent activity was consistent and well established, the kind of microhabitat that functions, without anyone intending it, as a reliable feeding station for ambush predators. Naveen returned home shortly after 2 a.m., after an evening with co-workers at a local bar. A neighbor saw him walking along the lane, unsteady but upright, heading toward the rear of the property. He did not go inside. He pulled his mat from its usual position near the storage corner and lay down. There were no lights on. Unfortunately, there was no one with him, except a sneaky, venomous predator. Russell's vipers are among the most dangerous snakes in Asia, responsible for more human fatalities annually than nearly any other species on the continent. An adult specimen reaches nearly 5 feet in length and carries a hemotoxic venom that disrupts the blood's ability to clot, attacks the kidneys directly, and works slowly enough that victims frequently fail to recognize the severity of what has happened to them. They do not chase. They sit and wait, remaining motionless near cover and rodent activity, and they strike when disturbed. At some point before dawn, he likely rolled onto the snake. The viper, estimated to be a large adult that had likely been resting against the base of the feed sacks, struck once, driving both fangs into the lower jaw and neck region. Naveen likely woke briefly, registered pain, and reached toward his face. He may even have assumed he had cut himself on the ground during a restless shift in sleep. Whatever he did that night, what we know is that he did not call out. The neighbor heard nothing. By the time the sky began to lighten, he was drifting in and out of sleep, remaining largely motionless afterward. Through the first day, the envenomation progressed without being recognized. However, his gums began to bleed around midday. He told his aunt, who came by with food, that he had bitten himself during the night. His face had begun to swell along the jaw. He was lethargic and nauseous, which his family attributed to the drinking. For me, this is the part that makes the case especially unsettling. A single defensive strike during an ordinary moment of sleep was enough to quietly set the entire outcome in motion, and nobody around him realized what had happened. He ate very little and slept through most of the afternoon and evening. No one examined the bite site closely. The 2 small puncture wounds, already surrounded by discolored and swelling tissue, were not identified as a snake bite. By the second day, the hemorrhagic process had advanced. His urine output had dropped sharply. The bruising spreading across his neck and upper chest was visible and significant. His speech had become slow and imprecise. A family member noted that his skin had become pale and his urine noticeably darker. Still, the decision was made to wait and see. I'm sitting in front of my laptop reading this, thinking, do the people around him actually know what it means to be hungover? He was brought to a government hospital on the morning of the third day, approximately 60 hours after the bite. Blood panels returned, findings consistent with severe coagulopathy and acute renal failure. Antivenom was administered, but the organ damage was beyond reversal. He died in the early afternoon of August 22nd. The coroner's report recorded the cause of death as delayed envenomation following Russell's viper bite, with contributory findings of venom-induced consumptive coagulopathy and acute bilateral renal failure. The time of death was listed as 1:47 p.m. The storage corner was inspected. The snake was not found. In my opinion, Naveen's drinking absolutely contributed to the delay, but the people around him failed him just as badly by dismissing obvious medical distress as nothing more than another hangover. The decision to wait and see likely cost him the narrow window where treatment still could have saved his life. Meanwhile, this next guy was wide awake, trained, armed, and on a military patrol, and it still didn't matter. It was March 8th, 2013, and the Brazilian Amazon had already begun swallowing the light by the time Sergeant Paulo Renes led his squad through the western edge of Acre State, a place where the jungle doesn't thin out, it closes in, and where the ground beneath your boots is never quite solid enough to trust. Rene was 34 years old, a career infantry soldier from Fortaleza who had spent 11 of those years in active service, including 2 prior jungle rotations. He had 3 weeks left on a 6-month rotation that had stretched into 7 due to personnel shortages. His wife had given birth to their second child 4 months earlier, a boy he had held exactly once. Already, this is a tough read. The squad's assignment that evening was a routine perimeter sweep of a suspected encampment site. Nothing had turned up in 2 days. The men were tired in the particular way that accumulates slowly: bad sleep, wet gear, repetitive movement through identical terrain. Rene was walking rear center of a 5-man file when they entered a low corridor of overgrowth near a creek drainage, the kind of passage where the canopy drops and the floor becomes a mat of decomposing leaves, root tangles, and standing water no deeper than your ankle. All members of the squad were wearing standard issue jungle fatigues with blouse trousers secured over reinforced combat boots, reducing but not eliminating exposure at points of flexion during movement through dense vegetation and uneven ground. At approximately 5:40 p.m., Rene stepped through a cluster of broad-leafed ground cover near the drainage edge. A bushmaster struck from concealed vegetation at ground level, biting into the lower leg just above the boot line during a weight transfer step on uneven terrain. The bushmaster is the longest venomous snake in the Western Hemisphere, reaching up to 12 feet and weighing close to 11 pounds. Its fangs can exceed 1 inch in length and deliver a hemotoxic venom that causes severe coagulopathy, vascular damage, and systemic bleeding disorders. People said that Rene's went down immediately. The puncture wounds were small, easy to underestimate, but his squad leader recognized the severity of the situation. He applied a field bandage within minutes, and they began moving him out by stretcher. The nearest facility equipped to treat severe envenomation was a military hospital in Rio Branco, a journey that under normal conditions required several hours by road, and these were not normal conditions. The terrain between their position and the extraction point involved creek crossings and a ridge section that turned to mud in the wet season. A medevac helicopter had no viable landing zone within 4 kilometers of their position, and worsening canopy density further limited extraction options. None of these factors had been formally elevated as a compounding risk before the patrol departed. The swelling started within the first hour. By the third hour, it had spread beyond the immediate bite site and was tracking upward along the limb, the skin tightening and discoloring into deep bruising patterns. His gums began bleeding around hour 5, then his nose. His blood pressure was falling by the time they reached the first creek crossing, and the stretcher movement on uneven ground was slow, sometimes less than a kilometer per hour. He was conscious, but increasingly incoherent. There's not much info on what Rene was saying during this time, but it made me think of his family. By this point, the squad had covered a greater than expected distance in fragmented segments due to repeated terrain bottlenecks, reducing overall evacuation efficiency despite continuous movement. By the 12th hour, he had gone into circulatory shock. His extremities were cold. His breathing was shallow and irregular. He died somewhere between hours 17 and 18, still on the stretcher, still in the jungle, still several kilometers from the extraction point. Renee had been trained to engage armed combatants in hostile environments. These men were carrying rifles, radios, medical kits, and years of military training, yet they were so helpless. Back in Fortaleza, his wife received the notification, leaving 2 children to grow up with almost no memory of the man who had spent years surviving combat environments, only to die during a routine jungle patrol. From the jungle, let's go to a more domestic place. The next one happened in a kitchen. It was January 27th, 2016, and the village outside Morogoro, Tanzania had not yet stirred when the darkness inside Halima Nteko's kitchen became the last place she would ever stand upright. Halima was 51 years old, a subsistence farmer who had worked the same plot of land for 3 decades. She grew cassava and maize, sold modest surpluses at the Morogoro market on Thursdays. She had raised 4 children largely on her own after her husband's death in 2008, and she carried that weight without ceremony. Cooking before sunrise was not a habit. It was the architecture of her days. According to her family, that morning she rose at 4:45 a.m., as she always did. The kitchen was a detached mud brick structure behind the main house, dim and cool. Her oldest daughter was asleep. The village was silent. The cupboard where Halima stored her cookware sat low to the ground, its door warped slightly so it never fully closed. A sack of dried maize had been kept beside it for several days after the previous harvest, and family members later said rats had been getting into the kitchen at night. The cupboard's dark lower space likely offered the snake temporary cover while hunting rodents drawn to the grain. There had been talk in the village in the weeks prior about snakes being spotted closer to homes. The dry season had pushed them towards structures that retained heat. Halima's neighbor had killed a small puff adder near his doorway only days earlier and had mentioned it to others. Whether Halima heard this or dismissed it as neighborhood talk is not known. What is known is that she did not use a light. She reached in. The black mamba is among the most dangerous snakes on Earth. Adults commonly reach 8 to 9 feet in length and can move at speeds approaching up to about 10 to 12 miles per hour in short bursts on open ground. Their venom is almost entirely neurotoxic, attacking the nervous system with a speed that separates them from most other species. A single bite delivers enough dendrotoxin to kill an adult human in as little as 45 minutes without treatment. They are not aggressive by nature, but they are defensive without hesitation when cornered. The mamba struck the back of her right hand. The bite itself lasted less than a second. Halima pulled her arm back sharply and stumbled away from the cupboard. Her daughter, woken by the sound of the clay pot hitting the floor, found her mother standing in the center of the kitchen, shaking her hand. Halima told her daughter she had been bitten by something. She looked for the perpetrator and found the snake. Her daughter and a neighbor loaded her into a vehicle and drove toward the nearest clinic, 6 miles away. The drive already took 22 minutes, and as if it couldn't get any worse, the clinic had no anti-venom when they arrived. Staff noted her pupils were dilated and unresponsive. Her breathing had become shallow and irregular. The hospital in Morogoro that stocked anti-venom was another 19 miles. The family was told to go. Now I think that's crazy. These nurses and doctors knew they wouldn't make it, and they still gave the family hope. Needless to say, they did not make it in time. Halima Nteko died in the vehicle. Time from bite to death was estimated at 94 minutes. She was buried 3 days later in a ceremony attended by most of the village. Her children stood at the graveside without speeches. Tanzania has maintained some of the lowest anti-venom stockpile rates in sub-Saharan Africa for over 2 decades, a problem health officials have documented repeatedly and governments have addressed rarely. Corruption at the procurement level ensures that what funding exists rarely reaches the facilities that need it most. In my opinion, that's what killed Halima.